Tonight, we open a door the world was never meant to enter. A trail of rituals carved in stone, whispered in forgotten prayers, then sealed away under centuries of silence. These are not fairy tales of mummies or myths of pyramids. They are technologies of the soul, maps of power, ceremonies that once promised transformation, hidden in plain sight, until the Vatican called them dangerous. For centuries, the Church has claimed to guard the light, yet behind its walls lies an older fire, one it tried to smother. Egyptian rites of purification, naming, rebirth, and communion were not destroyed. They were buried, rewritten, and disguised as superstition. And those who remembered, those who dared to keep the old ways alive, were silenced, their knowledge condemned as heresy. This is not just about lost scrolls or broken temples. It is about a deliberate erasure, a theft of memory that turned living science into forbidden magic. The archives of the Vatican still hold fragments of these rituals, locked away where no one may see, while echoes survive in our festivals, in our churches, even in the prayers we still speak. So, before you dismiss this as legend, ask yourself, what if the oldest key to the human spirit was hidden not by time, but by choice? What if the rites of Egypt still breathe beneath the surface, waiting to return? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we uncover what the Vatican tried to erase. Imagine a night without stars, a chamber lit only by the flicker of one flame. A priest kneels before a stone altar, whispering words that no one around him understands anymore. The names he speaks are names once feared, once worshipped, the names of gods who shaped a civilization. Yet in this moment they sound like echoes, fading with each breath. When the last word leaves his lips, there is silence, and in that silence lies a mystery that has haunted history. Who buried the ancient rituals of Egypt, and why were they meant to vanish? Egypt was not a land of superstition, as schoolbooks sometimes suggest. It was a land where ritual was science, where temples were laboratories, and where priests treated words as tools that could bend reality. But those rituals were not destroyed in a single night. They were slowly erased, buried beneath layers of translation, condemnation, and silence. By the time the Renaissance arrived, much of the old knowledge was already locked away, remembered only in fragments. Yet in secret places, in forgotten papyri, and in echoes hidden in other religions, the shadow of these rituals survived. The Vatican's role in this story is not one of open fire, but of quiet suppression. As Christianity rose in power across the Mediterranean, it did not simply ignore Egypt's traditions, it targeted them. Pagan became the word that cut a line between what could be preserved and what had to be hidden. Rituals that once opened the soul to the stars were labelled dangerous spells. Ceremonies that trained priests to balance the forces of life and death were recast as demonic illusions. And slowly, the memory of Egypt's sacred practices became something whispered about but never spoken aloud. Picture a time after the fall of Rome in the 5th century. Libraries once filled with scrolls about gods, stars, and the journey of the soul are emptied. Manuscripts vanish into monasteries, where only fragments are copied, carefully chosen to fit new doctrines. A book like the Book of Coming Forth by Day, which once guided souls through the afterlife, is dismissed as superstition, while its deeper lessons remain unspoken. And so a civilization that once measured time by the rising of Sirius and mapped eternity with precise formulas is reduced in the eyes of later generations to a land of tombs and curses. But ask yourself, why erase so much? Was it simply fear of competition between gods, or was there more? Ancient Egypt's rituals were not random chants or strange dances. They were designed to shape human consciousness, to open doors inside the mind and connect life with forces of the cosmos. If people had remembered that power, would they still have needed a church to stand between them and the divine? Or would they have realized the divine was already within them? The flicker of that first candle has long gone out, but the silence it left behind still lingers. In that silence, we hear not just the absence of words, but the sound of something stolen. The story of the forbidden Egyptian rituals is not only about what was practiced thousands of years ago, it is about what was hidden and why, and about the hands that decided which truths the world was allowed to keep. In the ruins of temples scattered along the Nile, carved into stone walls and written on fading papyri, fragments of rituals still whisper their secrets. These fragments survived not by chance, but in defiance of a long campaign to erase them. Once, these rituals were the very heartbeat of Egyptian civilization, guiding kings, farmers, and priests in their understanding of life, death, and the universe itself. Yet history, as it is taught today, often dismisses them as nothing more than primitive superstition. This dismissal was not an accident. It was a deliberate charge, a trial in which ancient knowledge was judged and condemned by rising powers determined to reshape human memory. When Christianity spread across the Roman Empire and into Egypt by the 3rd and 4th centuries, it faced a land where spiritual science was deeply rooted. Temples in Thebes, Abydos, and Philae still conducted ceremonies that traced their lineage back thousands of years. These ceremonies honored gods and stars, but more than that, they were technologies of the soul. In the eyes of new rulers, they were dangerous. To admit their worth would mean admitting that truth could exist outside the growing authority of the church. And so, these rites were put on trial, not in a courtroom with witnesses and evidence, but in the quieter court of power, where a single decree could silence centuries of tradition. By the late 4th century, imperial edicts were issued, banning sacrifices and temple rituals. Priests who once invoked the power of Ra or Isis found themselves branded as magicians, their practices condemned as pagan sorcery. The very word pagan became a weapon, reshaping the image of Egypt's wisdom into something shameful. Knowledge that had once been seen as a path to harmony was now cast as a threat to salvation. In this way, memory itself was manipulated. If you could convince people that their ancestors' wisdom was dangerous, you did not need to destroy every manuscript. People would burn it themselves, out of fear. But fragments remained, hidden in underground chambers, copied into secret scrolls, or even absorbed into Christian rites, disguised under new names. Purification rituals became baptisms. Sacred meals of bread and beer became echoes in the Eucharist. Anointing oils used in the embalming of kings became holy chrism in churches. The knowledge did not truly die. It adapted, it disguised itself, it waited. Yet its Egyptian origins were erased, and those who remembered were taught to stay silent. This was the charge: to brand what once gave meaning to an entire civilization as heresy. It was not just the priests who stood on trial, but memory itself. For centuries, the fragments that slipped through this net of control were ridiculed, misunderstood, or locked away in private collections. The verdict delivered by history books was that Egypt's spiritual science was nothing more than myth. And yet here we are, still asking questions, still finding traces in rituals we perform today without realizing their roots. The trial may have buried much, but it never destroyed everything. In the shadows of what remains lies the truth of a knowledge that refused to die. Long before the cross became the most powerful symbol in the Western world, Egypt had already built an entire system for understanding the soul. It was not framed as faith in the way we often imagine religion today. It was more like a science, a structured technology designed to shape human consciousness. The Egyptians believed that life and death were not opposites, but two sides of a larger journey, and through ritual they learned to navigate that journey with precision. To them, the human being was not just flesh, but a layered existence made up of forces and essences that could be strengthened, purified, and guided. They called this the science of the soul, and its rules were as exact as the stars above. At the heart of this system was Ma'at, a word that meant much more than truth. Ma'at was balance, order, the harmony that kept the world from collapsing into chaos. Every ritual, no matter how small, was an act of restoring Ma'at. When a priest placed food on an altar, when a farmer recited a hymn before the fields, when a pharaoh gave offerings to the gods, each action was meant to tip the scale toward balance. Living against Ma'at was believed to weaken the soul. Living with it made one lighter than the feather of truth, ready to pass through death without fear. This was not a metaphor for them. It was as real as the sunrise. Yet, balance alone was not enough. The Egyptians also spoke of Heka, the raw power of creation itself. Heka was not magic in the modern sense of tricks or illusions. It was the fuel of the universe, the energy that made the gods themselves come alive. Through words, gestures, and objects infused with meaning, Heka could be directed. Priests trained for years to master the exact tones of chants, the precise angles of movement, the specific materials that could channel this force. To speak a name in ritual was not simply to identify something. It was to call its essence into presence. This was power measured not by superstition but by practice, repeated across generations with the precision of an experiment. And above all of this stood the stars. Egyptian rituals were not random or scheduled on convenience. They were timed to the cosmos, set to the rising of Sirius, the shifting of Orion, the cycles of the sun and moon. Temples were aligned so that sunlight would pierce inner chambers only on certain days, turning architecture into a cosmic clock. Priests became timekeepers of eternity, mapping the heavens not just for farming seasons, but for the rhythm of ceremonies that promised immortality. To enter a temple at the right moment was to step into a living equation where sky and earth met. This was the old science of the soul, practiced for thousands of years before other systems claimed to hold the key to eternity. It was not blind faith. It was observation, memory, and discipline crafted into ritual form. And even as later powers tried to bury it beneath new symbols and names, echoes of Ma'at, Heka, and the star-born timing of rites still survive, reminding us that Egypt once measured human life not only in years, but in eternity. When most people hear the words Book of the Dead, they imagine dusty scrolls filled with strange drawings, maybe curses meant to scare intruders from tombs. Hollywood has turned it into a book of monsters, superstition, and magic gone wrong. But the truth about this text, which the Egyptians called the Book of Coming Forth by Day, is far more powerful and far more unsettling. It was not a book for the dead at all. It was a manual for the living, a step-by-step guide to transform the soul into something eternal. Every spell, every hymn, every picture was a map for consciousness itself, teaching a person how to move through realities beyond death. Imagine standing inside a tomb freshly sealed, walls covered in painted symbols, lines of hieroglyphs running in neat columns. To an untrained eye, it might look like decoration, but to the initiated priest, or to the soul of the departed, these were instructions. They explained how to navigate the duat, the mysterious realm between death and rebirth. They showed how to pass the guardians, how to speak the right words at the right gates, how to have one's heart weighed and not found heavy with sin. In short, they were the directions for a journey no one could avoid. But here is the secret that textbooks rarely mention. These rituals were practiced long before anyone died. They were rehearsed while alive, as if life itself was the training ground for eternity. The spells themselves reveal this. Many do not speak about corpses or mummies at all. Instead, they command the reader to see, to know, to transform. One text reads like an affirmation, declaring that the soul is not trapped but free to rise like the sun. Another describes the soul taking the form of a falcon to soar above the earth. Others provide dialogues, almost like scripts for a play, where the initiate must answer cosmic judges with statements of truth. These are not the words of a terrified spirit. They are the voice of someone prepared, someone trained. It suggests that the Book of Coming Forth by Day was used during ceremonies of initiation, teaching disciples how to face fear, how to master the self, and how to embody Ma'at. Why then has it been cast as a funerary superstition? The answer lies in later centuries, when outside cultures saw only the surface. By labeling it as a death text, they stripped it of its living power. A manual for the soul became nothing more than a burial accessory. A guide to enlightenment became a curiosity in museums. And behind that shift lurked a deeper agenda. If humanity remembered that it once possessed a roadmap to eternal awareness, what power would remain for those who claimed to hold the keys of heaven? The Book of Coming Forth by Day was scripted for eternity, but not the eternity of tombs. It was written for the eternity of the human spirit, alive and awake. In its spells, we see not fear of death, but mastery over it, a vision that still challenges the story we have been told about who we are and what we can become. In ancient Egypt, a name was never just a label. It was a doorway, a key, a force that could unlock hidden layers of reality. The Egyptians called it the Ren, the true name of a person or a god, and to know it was to hold power over their essence. Imagine speaking a word and not just describing something, but calling it into presence. For Egyptians, words were alive, and the act of naming was an act of creation itself. This belief turned language into one of the most guarded tools of ritual science. The Ren was more than the sound of a name. It was tied to the soul. Egyptians believed that as long as a person's name was remembered and spoken, their spirit lived on. To erase a name was to kill twice, once in body and once in memory. That is why pharaohs carved their cartouches deep into stone, so that centuries later their names would still echo through time. To preserve the Ren was to preserve eternity. To curse it, to scratch it out, was to condemn the soul to oblivion. The stakes were that high. Rituals used this power deliberately. Priests recited the hidden names of gods during ceremonies, believing that the moment a name was spoken, the divine presence manifested. Hymns in temples often list dozens of titles for a single deity, each unlocking a different aspect of their power. Isis was mother, queen, healer, star of the sea, and each name carried a distinct force. To know the secret name of a god was to wield influence even over them. Legends tell of Isis tricking the sun god Ra by demanding his hidden name, proving that knowledge of the Ren could shift the balance even among gods. The use of names did not end with Egypt. The theology of the word carried into later traditions, reshaped but recognizable. Exorcistic formulas in Christian practice often demand the demon's name, claiming that once identified it loses power. Sacred names of God, spoken only in whispers or encoded in sigils, echo the same Egyptian belief that the right word can bend reality. Even the idea of baptism, where a new name is given in a sacred act, reflects this ancient understanding that names are not casual, they are tools of transformation. Why then were these practices recast as dangerous? Because in the wrong hands, control of names meant control of people, spirits, even gods. To strip this knowledge from memory was to place the power of the word into fewer hands, guarded by institutions that would decide when and how it could be used. The Ren was turned from a universal tool into a forbidden secret. Every time we sign our names, every time we speak a word meant to bless or curse, we unknowingly echo a science once carefully cultivated in Egypt. Names open doors, not just in memory, but in the fabric of reality itself. And when the Vatican and others worked to brand such practices as superstition, what they were really hiding was the reminder that words are never just words. They are forces waiting to be spoken into form. The Egyptians believed that a human being was not just a body walking the earth, but a fusion of forces that extended far beyond the physical. They spoke of the Ka, the Ba, and the breath of life, as if these were as real and tangible as skin and bone. To them, the soul was not a single invisible spark, but a layered design that could be strengthened, weakened, or even lost, depending on how one lived and how one was prepared through ritual. This tripartite model of the soul may seem strange at first, but its echoes can still be heard in later ideas of spirit, grace, and eternal life. The Ka was the vital essence, the life force that entered at birth and left at death. It was like an invisible twin, a copy of the self that fed on offerings and prayers. In tomb paintings, you often see a figure seated at a table of bread and beer while a faint double hovers nearby. That double is the Ka, nourished not by physical food, but by ritual acts of remembrance. Families were expected to keep feeding the Ka through ceremonies long after a loved one's death, because to let the Ka starve was to let the soul fade into nothing. The Ba was different. It was the personality, the unique character of a person, often depicted as a human-headed bird, able to fly between the realms of the living and the dead. The Ba could leave the body at night, wander the world, and return by dawn. In funerary texts, the Ba is shown hovering over a mummy, proof that identity and memory survived even when the flesh was still. Rituals were designed to strengthen this freedom, giving the Ba the power to navigate the afterlife with confidence, to avoid being trapped or lost in the underworld. And then there was the breath, sometimes called Shu, or the breath of Ra, the force that animated everything. Without breath the body was silent, but with it the Ka and Ba had a vessel through which to act. Priests performed rites of breathing over statues and mummies, using sacred words and gestures to restore the divine breath. The famous opening of the mouth ceremony, where a ritual tool touched the lips of the deceased, was more than a symbolic gesture. It was meant to give breath back to the soul, ensuring it could speak, eat, and live again in eternity. Later religions would translate these ideas into sacraments of spirit. Baptism carried the breath of new life, communion fed the essence, prayers for the dead nourished the departed, much like offerings for the Ka. But in Egypt, these were not mysteries to be guessed at. They were daily practices, repeated for thousands of years with the conviction that they worked. The tripartite soul model was not an abstract theory. It was a system of survival, one that treated the human being as a bridge between heaven and earth, flesh and eternity. Even now, the memory of Ka, Ba, and breath reminds us that to the Egyptians, the soul was not a fragile flame, but a carefully tended force that could endure forever. Step into an Egyptian temple, and you will realize it was never built to be just a place of worship. These massive structures were machines of the spirit, designed with such precision that every wall, every hallway, every shaft of light worked together to alter the mind of anyone who entered. They were not churches in the modern sense, where a sermon was given and people sat in pews. They were sensory engines, carefully engineered to guide someone out of ordinary awareness and into contact with the divine. The Egyptians understood something that most of us forget. Environment shapes consciousness. The way you walk, the way you hear echoes, the way shadows fall, all of it changes the way you think and feel. And their temples were built to take advantage of this truth. Imagine walking through a processional route during a festival. The priests carry statues of the gods, chanting as drums pound and incense fills the air. The route is not random. It follows a sacred geometry, lined with sphinxes or columns that create rhythm as you walk. The repetition of sound, smell, and sight is overwhelming, pulling you out of everyday life. By the time the procession reaches the temple gates, you are no longer just a spectator. You are already inside a ritual machine that has reshaped your senses. Inside the temple, the hypostyle hall rises like a forest of stone pillars. Each column is carved with gods, symbols, and stories, towering above you to make you feel small, humble, and open to higher powers. Light filters through small openings, casting patterns that change as the sun moves. At certain times of day, beams strike directly onto carved images of gods, as if the heavens themselves are speaking. The hall is not just architecture. It is a chamber tuned to the rhythm of sky and earth, pressing awe into the minds of those who pass through. Deeper still lie the sealed sanctuaries, Few were ever allowed to enter these hidden chambers. They were dark, small, and cut off from the outside world. Here the silence was so thick that the beating of your own heart became a drum. In such spaces, rituals took on new force. The sudden opening of a door to reveal a golden statue, or the lighting of a single lamp in total darkness, created shock, awe, and transformation. The design was psychological, deliberate, and powerful. This is why temples can be seen as machines. They were built not only of stone, but of sound, light, and movement. They created an experience that could shift consciousness, preparing the mind to receive visions, revelations, or a sense of union with the gods. Later, civilizations copied this idea in cathedrals with their stained glass and soaring ceilings, but Egypt had mastered it millennia earlier. To stand in an ancient temple was to be placed inside a living instrument tuned to the frequencies of heaven and earth, a place where human beings were reshaped not by force but by design. When we look up at the night sky today, most of us see only stars twinkling at random. But for the priests of ancient Egypt, the sky was a calendar, a clock, and a ladder for the soul. They did not simply admire the constellations. They tracked them with precision, knowing that certain stars rose and set at exact times that could guide rituals, mark festivals, and even open gateways of transformation. Among these, none was more important than Sirius, the brightest star in the heavens. Its rising in the east each year, just before the sun, announced the flooding of the Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt. This moment, called the heliacal rising of Sirius, was not just about farming, it was about renewal, a cosmic signal that heaven and earth were in sync once again. Priests waited for this event, with instruments far simpler than modern telescopes, yet astonishingly accurate. They watched from temple rooftops, aligning their gaze with carved sightlines built into the stone. At dawn, when Sirius appeared in the purple glow of the horizon, it was the signal that a new year had begun. Ceremonies followed, not as symbolic gestures, but as living technology. Just as the river would rise to nourish the land, the rituals were meant to raise the spirit, flooding the soul with the energy of rebirth. Orion, too, played a central role. To the Egyptians, Orion was the celestial body of Osiris, the god of death and resurrection. Temples, such as those at Giza, were aligned so that the stars of Orion's belt mirrored the placement of the pyramids themselves. This was no accident. It was a sky ladder, a cosmic map showing the path a soul must travel to join the gods. Rituals performed at night often invoked Orion, calling on the soul of the pharaoh to ascend among the stars and take his place as an eternal being. The heavens were not a backdrop, they were the destination. Every major temple carried this marriage of sky and stone. Columns were aligned with solstices, shrines opened to specific star risings, and ceilings were painted with constellations that guided both priest and pilgrim. Time was not measured by hours on a clock, but by the movement of light across carvings, the appearance of Venus in the evening, the shift of Orion in the night sky. Each alignment was another rung on the cosmic ladder, reminding the people that their lives were woven into the fabric of the universe. Later cultures would borrow this system, turning star lore into horoscopes, calendars, and prophecies. But in Egypt, the stars were never just symbols. They were engines of transformation. By timing their rituals to the heavens, priests created a harmony between human beings and the cosmos itself. To climb the sky ladder was to remember that you were not small, not forgotten, but part of an eternal pattern. And though later powers tried to bury this knowledge, the stars remain above us, unchanged, still whispering the same truths the Egyptians once lived by. In the halls of Egyptian myth, there is a moment every soul must face, the weighing of the heart. It is not a tale meant only for the dead. It was an ethical technology, a system that shaped how people lived every day. The heart, called the Ib, was believed to hold memory, conscience, and truth. When life ended, the heart was placed on a scale and weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and balance. If the heart was heavy with lies, greed, or cruelty, it tipped the scale, and the soul was devoured by Amit, a beast with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the haunches of a hippopotamus. If the heart was light, balanced with Ma'at, the soul was free to continue its journey into eternity. This vision was not meant to scare people into obedience. It was designed as a tool of reflection, a ritualized audit of conscience. The Egyptians created what is called the negative confessions, a series of declarations spoken by the soul before 42 divine judges. These were not random rules. They were precise statements like, "I have not stolen, I have not lied, I have not caused suffering, I have not polluted the river." Each was a way of keeping the scales balanced, not only in death but in daily life. To speak them aloud was to shape the heart into harmony with Ma'at. It was practice for the ultimate test, but also training for living with integrity. Imagine standing in a temple, repeating these words during a ceremony. Each line forces you to examine yourself, to measure your actions against the cosmic order. The ritual was not just about morality, it was about energy. A heavy heart was thought to drag the soul down, chaining it to chaos. A light heart rose like a feather, freed to soar among the stars. This was a psychology thousands of years before the word psychology existed, a way of keeping people accountable, not through fear of earthly punishment, but through the promise of cosmic justice. Later traditions would echo this idea. Christian confessions, Islamic records of deeds, even modern practices of examining conscience all mirror the Egyptian model. But in Egypt, the act was never hidden in private chambers, or left to the hands of priests alone. It was written into texts, carved on tomb walls, rehearsed in rituals so that every person knew the standards by which they would be weighed. Ma'at was not abstract. It was the rhythm of the Nile, the fairness of trade, the honesty of speech. To live outside of it was to break the harmony of the universe. The weighing of the heart was both terrifying and inspiring. It meant that no king, no priest, no farmer could escape the truth of their own actions. Power could not buy a lighter heart. Only living with Ma'at could. And that idea, carved into stone thousands of years ago, still carries a challenge for us today. What would our hearts weigh if placed on that scale? Would they rise like feathers, or sink beneath the weight of what we choose to ignore? The story of Isis, Osiris, and Horus is one of the oldest dramas of death and return, a tale that shaped Egyptian religion for thousands of years. At first glance, it seems like a myth, a legend about gods in conflict. But to the Egyptians, it was far more than a story. It was an initiation, a cycle of dismemberment, reassembly, and rebirth that taught people how to face death and emerge transformed. In its symbols lay a lesson that reached beyond Egypt, one that would later echo in mystery plays across the Mediterranean, and even in the foundations of later religions. Osiris was a king beloved by his people, said to have brought them law, agriculture, and culture itself. His brother Set, consumed by jealousy, murdered him, cutting his body into pieces and scattering them across the land. The story could have ended there, a tragedy without hope. But Isis, wife and sister of Osiris, refused to accept that death was final. She gathered the fragments, piece by piece, reassembling his body with devotion and magic. Through her love and her skill in sacred rites, Osiris was restored, not to the living world, but to a new role as lord of the underworld, a ruler who could guide souls through the passage of death. From their union came Horus, the falcon god, who would grow to challenge Set and reclaim the throne of Egypt. This cycle of murder, mourning, resurrection, and triumph became more than myth. It became a mirror for every human life. To die was to be torn apart, to undergo ritual was to be reassembled, and to live again in eternity was to rise like Horus, victorious over chaos. Every temple festival that reenacted this cycle was more than performance. It was training for the soul, teaching people how to endure loss, how to find hope, and how to trust that death was not the end but a doorway. The ceremonies dedicated to Osiris often included dramatic plays. Priests would act out the dismemberment, the search of Isis, the birth of Horus, and the final victory over Set. Participants were not just watching, they were drawn into the story, identifying with the characters and feeling the weight of their trials. To be initiated into the Osirian mysteries was to experience symbolically the process of dying and being reborn, to understand that suffering and loss could be turned into renewal. This cycle would echo across time. The Greek mystery cults of Dionysus and Eleusis carried similar themes. Later Christian traditions of death, burial, and resurrection carry familiar patterns that may not be coincidence. The idea that through death comes new life, that through loss comes return, is one of the oldest spiritual technologies in human history. And Egypt was among the first to encode it into ritual form. The passion of Isis, Osiris, and Horus was not simply a myth to explain why the Nile floods or why kings rule. It was a map of the human journey, showing that destruction can be followed by renewal, that death can be a teacher, and that every ending can also be a return. To the Egyptians, the universe was not random. It was built on laws as precise as the rising of the sun or the flooding of the Nile. Within this ordered cosmos, they believed there was a force that bound everything together, a current of creation itself. They called it Heka. Today, the word is usually translated as magic, but that translation strips away its depth. Heka was not illusion or superstition. It was the physics of the word, the idea that sound, gesture, and material could act as levers to move the universe. Priests were not stage performers. They were technicians, working with formulas that they believed had been present since the dawn of time. Ritual speech was the foundation of Heka. Words were not thought of as empty descriptions. When spoken in the correct tone, with the correct rhythm, they were believed to carry the power to change reality. To recite a god's name was to summon that god's presence. To speak a declaration of purity was to become pure. Hieroglyphs carved on stone were not just writing, but living images, containers of force that could continue to act for centuries. A spell on a tomb wall was not meant to be read casually. It was meant to echo forever, ensuring that the soul of the dead was protected through eternity. Gesture was just as important. Priests did not move randomly during ceremonies. Every motion had weight. The raising of hands, the striking of a staff, the pouring of libations, all were actions calculated to align the human body with divine order. Statues were animated not through imagination, but through ritual touch. The famous opening of the mouth ceremony, where a tool pressed against lips to give them life. To us, it may seem symbolic, but for the Egyptians, it was as real as breathing air. If the gestures were correct, the god would truly enter the image. Materia, the physical substances of ritual, also carried their own power. Oils pressed from plants, stones chosen for their colour and weight, pigments for ink, all were considered fragments of divine energy. Gold was not simply precious because it was rare. It was seen as incorruptible, the flesh of the gods themselves. Lapis lazuli was linked to the sky. Incense rising in smoke was thought to carry prayers upward. By combining these materials with word and gesture, priests were not making symbolic offerings. They were constructing actual bridges between heaven and earth. This system reveals something profound. The Egyptians did not divide the world into natural and supernatural. To them, Heka was woven into the structure of existence. Just as water flows downhill or fire consumes wood, words and rituals carried effects when used correctly. That is why priests trained for years, memorizing thousands of lines, mastering the timing of movements, learning which materials to use. The cosmos was lawful, and Heka was the science of aligning with that law. Later, ages would condemn such practices as sorcery, but Fragments survived. The idea that blessings or curses can shape life, the belief in holy oils, sacred texts, and ritual gestures all echo the Egyptian conviction that reality responds to the right combination of sound, action, and matter. In that sense, Heka was not primitive magic. It was humanity's first attempt to harness the deep physics of the word. In the long history of Egypt, scribes were more than record keepers. They were guardians of power, initiates who carried the keys to knowledge that most people could never touch. Every temple, every tomb, every scroll depended on their skill. But what made their craft extraordinary was not simply the ability to write. It was the way they encoded knowledge into layers of script, building barriers around sacred teachings so that only those prepared could pass through. In this way, writing itself became a gate of initiation. Egyptian writing was never one single system. At the highest level stood hieroglyphics, the sacred carvings etched into temple walls and monuments. To the untrained eye, they looked like pictures of animals and objects, but to the scribe they were formulas of sound and meaning that carried living force. A single hieroglyph could be read as a word, a letter, or a symbol with hidden significance depending on the context. This complexity meant that only the most trained initiates could unlock their full depth. The ordinary farmer might see a bird, but the scribe saw an equation of spirit. For daily use, a faster script existed, called hieratic. It flowed like cursive, used on papyri for prayers, contracts, and instructions. But even within hieratic, certain phrases were reserved for ritual specialists, lines that carried double meanings when spoken aloud. Later still came demotic, a simplified script for common transactions, court records, and stories. It was practical, accessible, and widely used. Yet the layering was intentional. Sacred knowledge remained cloaked in hieroglyphs, semi-sacred in hieratic, and ordinary in demotic. To move from one script to the next was not just about learning a different handwriting. It was like climbing a ladder of initiation, each rung revealing a deeper layer of reality. Scribes guarded this ladder fiercely. Training often began in childhood, with years of memorization and copying. Students learned not just how to write, but how to think, how to recite, how to carry the weight of words. Mistakes were not tolerated, because a single slip in a ritual formula could mean the difference between harmony and chaos. A prayer miswritten could fail to summon a god. An error in a funerary spell could trap a soul forever. Precision was not academic, it was survival. This secrecy explains why so much ritual knowledge survived in fragments, but never in plain view. Even when texts were copied, the deepest meanings were hidden in wordplay, puns, or layered symbols only the initiated could decode. A single passage could appear harmless to outsiders, while carrying powerful instruction to those who knew the key. In this way, scribes were not just preserving knowledge, they were protecting it, ensuring it could not be misused or diluted. Later powers would inherit this model, turning sacred language into Latin chants or coded prayers reserved for priests alone. But Egypt set the pattern first. The craft of the scribes was not about hiding truth for selfish gain. It was about shaping access, about guiding seekers step by step so that the unprepared would not stumble into forces they could not understand. Writing was the veil, and only those who passed initiation could part it. Beneath the sands of Egypt, there once stretched labyrinths of stone, vast underground chambers where knowledge was stored as carefully as gold. The most famous of these was the Serapeum at Saqqara, a complex of catacombs that held not only the remains of sacred bulls, but also corridors that doubled as archives of ritual and memory. To walk those halls in ancient times was to step into the underground of human knowledge, a place where the wisdom of priests and scribes was hidden from casual eyes. These were not public libraries where anyone could stroll in to borrow a scroll. They were vaults, guarded and restricted, where only initiates could enter, and only with purpose. The Serapeum became legendary, not just because of what it held, but because of what it represented. It symbolized the Egyptian practice of placing the most sacred knowledge below the surface, concealed in chambers of darkness to protect it from corruption or misuse. The underground world mirrored the cosmos. Just as the sun disappeared each night into the duat, the underworld of transformation, so too did sacred texts descend into hidden spaces where they could endure beyond the reach of enemies or accidents. The wisdom of gods and stars was not kept in open sunlight. It was buried in shadow, waiting for the worthy to retrieve it. Temple archives followed the same pattern. Behind towering pylons and open courtyards lay sealed rooms where papyri were stored in chests, sorted and guarded by priest librarians. Some texts were mundane, like lists of offerings, but others contained hymns, initiation rites, and astronomical charts. These archives were treated as extensions of the divine itself. To lose a scroll was not just a mistake, it was a wound to Ma'at, the cosmic order. Priests sometimes ritually cursed anyone who would attempt to steal or deface these writings, a sign of how dangerous the loss of knowledge was considered. And yet losses did come. Fires, floods, and later invasions destroyed countless collections, but the greatest losses were often deliberate. When foreign powers or rising religions sought to erase Egypt's past, the hidden libraries became their targets. To burn a scroll was to silence a voice of the gods. To collapse a chamber was to erase centuries of memory in one act. What survived did so because it was overlooked, buried deeper than expected, or spirited away into secret hands. The pain of these disappearances is felt even today. We know from references carved in stone that there were texts describing advanced rituals, cosmic maps, and teachings about the soul that have never been recovered. We know that initiates once studied documents meant only for higher grades of priesthood, writings that explained mysteries with clarity instead of fragments. But instead of having them, we have gaps, holes in the fabric of history where libraries once stood. The Serapeum and the hidden archives remind us that the greatest treasures of Egypt were never jewels or statues. They were words, carefully preserved in the dark. And their disappearance is not just the story of a lost past. It is the story of how power has always sought to control memory by deciding which words survive and which vanish into silence. The city of Alexandria once stood as the beating heart of knowledge in the ancient world. Founded by Alexander the Great in the 4th century before Christ, it became a meeting place where Greek philosophy, Egyptian ritual, Jewish mysticism, and Eastern wisdom converged. At the center of this synthesis was the Great Library, a monumental collection said to hold hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Imagine standing within its halls, papyrus stacked floor to ceiling, containing not only the myths of nations, but their sciences, their medicine, their star charts, and their sacred rites. It was more than a library. It was the memory of humanity gathered in one place. For Egyptian ritual, this library was a lifeline. Centuries of temple knowledge, once confined to the Nile Valley, were copied, translated, and placed side by side with writings from Greece, Babylon, and India. This created a fusion of wisdom that allowed old practices to be compared, preserved, and expanded. A priest in Alexandria could study not only the Book of Coming Forth by day, but also Pythagorean mathematics, Chaldean astrology, and the medicine of distant lands. The rituals of Egypt were no longer isolated. They were part of a global dialogue, a lineage stretching across the Mediterranean. But history records that Alexandria burned, not once but several times. Fires during the Roman conquest, attacks under Emperor Aurelian, and the final blows under Christian rule all took their toll. Each destruction sent smoke rising into the sky as if the memory of the world itself was turning to ash. No one can say exactly how much was lost, but witnesses speak of entire shiploads of papyri seized and burned as fuel. In those flames, lineages were severed. Instructions for rituals, precise formulas of Heka, detailed astronomical tables tied to ceremonies, all of it could have vanished in a single night. The tragedy is not only in the destruction, but in the timing. The collapse of Alexandria's centres happened just as new powers were asserting control. To erase libraries was to erase alternatives, to cut the roots of traditions that might challenge the authority of a single rising faith. By severing the chain of transmission, what had been a living science of ritual was reduced to fragments and rumours. The rituals survived in small pockets, hidden in temples or whispered by secret groups, but the grand synthesis was gone. Egypt's sacred technology was no longer at the centre of a Mediterranean network. It was pushed to the margins, branded as superstition instead of respected as science. Even today, the loss haunts us. We read scraps of magical papyri that hint at a greater whole, or study temple carvings that seem incomplete. We imagine what secrets of the cosmos were written in those scrolls that now exist only as smoke in the memory of history. Alexandria was more than a city. It was the bridge between civilizations, and when it burned, the bridge collapsed. It is a choice, and it reshapes the world for centuries. By the time the Roman Empire was shifting into Christian rule, the most powerful weapon against Egyptian ritual was not the torch or the sword, it was the law. Imperial decrees and church anathemas worked like invisible chains, banning practices that had guided people for thousands of years and labeling them dangerous, criminal, or demonic. With each edict, the space for ritual life grew smaller, until the sacred science of Egypt was forced into the shadows. What could not be destroyed outright was made illegal, and what was made illegal soon became forgotten by fear. One of the first blows came in the late 4th century, when Emperor Theodosius issued laws that banned sacrifices throughout the empire. For Egypt, this was devastating. Sacrifice was not simply the killing of animals. It was a system of offerings that nourished the ka, balanced ma'at, and connected humans to the divine. To outlaw sacrifice was to outlaw the rhythm of the temples. Soon after came restrictions against consulting oracles, a practice long central to Egyptian religion. Priests had once spoken through statues of gods, answering questions with ritual precision. Now, those priests were branded as deceivers, and their consultations punishable offences. The Church added its voice with anathemas, formal condemnations that cast entire categories of practice into the realm of heresy. To burn incense to Isis was idolatry. To recite an ancient hymn was sorcery. To trace the stars for ritual timing was condemned as divination. The language was absolute. What had once been sacred was redefined as demonic. This shift was not about evidence or truth, it was about control. By drawing a line between acceptable worship and forbidden rites, the Church claimed the right to decide what contact with the divine looked like and who was allowed to mediate it. Enforcement was ruthless. Temples that ignored the decrees were shut down, sacred images were smashed, altars dismantled, and scrolls collected for burning. Archaeologists today still find traces of this violence. Statues of gods with chiseled faces, carvings hammered until they could no longer speak. Each act was more than vandalism. It was the legal erasure of memory. Once a practice was declared illegal, people no longer dared to teach it openly. Knowledge passed quietly from master to student, but every transmission risked exposure. Many chose silence rather than death. The ashes of these decrees still linger. When we look at Egyptian ritual today, so much of it is broken or incomplete, not because the Egyptians failed to record it, but because centuries of laws made its preservation impossible. The rituals did not die of old age. They were strangled by legislation, by lines of text signed by emperors and bishops, who believed that by outlawing sacrifice, oracles, and what they called magic, they were defending truth. In reality, they were narrowing it. And in those ashes lie the memories of countless ceremonies, voices, and names we will never hear again. Long before Christian baptism was performed in cathedrals and rivers, Egypt had already perfected the art of purification. Every temple ceremony began not with prayers or chants, but with water, oil, and linen. To approach the gods, one first had to be clean, not only in body but in spirit. Ablutions, anointings, and sacred garments were more than hygiene or symbolism. They were technologies of transformation, tools designed to strip away the weight of impurity and prepare a person for contact with the divine. In their form and meaning, these rituals echo so strongly in later Christian sacraments that the connection is difficult to ignore. In Egyptian temples, priests washed themselves in pools before dawn. These were not ordinary baths. The water was drawn from the Nile, sometimes from special channels believed to connect to the primeval waters of creation. To step into that water was to return to the beginning of time, to be reborn from the same chaos that birthed the world. The act was repeated at set hours, turning cleansing into a rhythm of daily life. By the time a priest entered the sanctuary, his body had been washed many times, his impurities dissolved into the sacred current. This was baptism before baptism, a ritual immersion meant to reset the soul. Anointing followed. Oils mixed with herbs and resins were applied to the body, not as perfume but as spiritual armor. Frankincense, myrrh, cedar, and lotus were believed to carry divine energies. When spread on the skin, they infused the ka, strengthening the life force and sealing the body against evil. The most sacred ceremonies included the anointing of statues and mummies, restoring vitality and inviting divine presence. Later Christian chrism, the holy oil used in baptism and confirmation, carries the same logic. To be anointed is to be marked, protected, and set apart. Linen vestments completed the transformation. Priests stripped away their everyday clothing and dressed in spotless white linen. Linen was not chosen by accident. Unlike wool, it carried no trace of animal death, symbolizing purity and renewal. To put on linen was to take on the role of the divine, to clothe oneself in light. In the opening of the mouth ceremony, where the dead were prepared for eternal life, linen wrappings were used to preserve the body and guide the soul. In Christian sacraments, the white garment worn after baptism serves the same purpose, a sign of rebirth into purity. These parallels reveal a deep continuity. The idea that contact with the divine requires cleansing, anointing, and new clothing was not invented in the first century of the Common Era. It had been practiced on the banks of the Nile for millennia. When Christianity spread into Egypt, it did not erase these rites. It reshaped them, renamed them, and placed them in a new theological frame. Yet the gestures remained the same: water to wash away, oil to empower, linen to renew. Beneath the surface of modern sacraments lies the ancient memory of Egyptian purifications, reminding us that even the simplest acts of washing and clothing once carried the weight of eternity. In the cool silence of Egyptian temples, one of the most important acts of ritual was not the dramatic invocation of gods or the chanting of long hymns. It was the simple act of offering food. Bread, beer, meat, and fruit were placed before statues of the gods, not as decoration but as a sacred meal that carried profound meaning. These offerings were not thought of as symbolic. They were believed to be transformed through ritual into the very substance of divinity. To eat such food, or even to touch it, was to take in the power of the gods themselves. It was a theology of presence long before anyone spoke of sacraments. Bread was the foundation of Egyptian life. Made from emmer wheat and baked daily, it was the staple that sustained both peasants and pharaohs. In ritual, bread became more than nourishment. Priests consecrated it with words of Heka, infusing it with divine force. The loaves were shaped in forms that carried meaning, sometimes round like the sun, or marked with patterns that echoed temple geometry. To consume bread after it had been offered was to consume the god, to merge human and divine in a single act of eating. Beer held equal importance, brewed thick and nourishing. It was both food and drink, a source of daily sustenance and a ritual gift. In temple rites, beer was poured before statues, soaked into altars, or consumed in festivals honoring Hathor, the goddess of joy and intoxication. The transformation was not about drunkenness, but about opening the heart, loosening the rigid barriers of ordinary consciousness. Beer became a tool of communion, a way of sharing essence between humans and gods. The phrase, drinking the divine, was more than poetry. It was the lived experience of ritual. But the deepest layer of meaning came in the concept of becoming the god. Through offerings, prayers, and sacred meals, the priest or initiate did not remain separate from the divine. By consuming bread and beer, the body itself became a vessel of the god's presence. In some texts, the initiate declares, "I am Osiris," or "I am Horus," not as a metaphor, but as a statement of transformation. The god was believed to dwell within, carried by the very food and drink offered on the altar. Later sacramental theologies echo these same ideas. The Christian Eucharist, in which bread and wine are said to become the body and blood of Christ, follows the same pattern. Ordinary food is consecrated, transformed, and consumed so that the divine presence may dwell within the believer. The parallels are too strong to ignore. Egypt had already set the template, turning meals into acts of transmutation, centuries before the sacraments were formalized. Bread, beer, and body remind us that the most profound rituals often appear simple. Eating and drinking become holy acts when infused with intention and belief. The Egyptians understood this long before the modern world. For them, every meal offered at the altar was a bridge between human and divine, a quiet but powerful way of becoming what one worshipped. The air of Egyptian temples was never empty. It was thick with the fragrance of oils, incense, and resins, a perfume that clung to walls and clothing, marking the space as sacred. These scents were not chosen for beauty alone. They were recipes, carefully guarded, believed to carry spiritual force. Among them was kaifi, the most famous of all Egyptian incenses, blended from honey, raisins, wine, frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, and other ingredients known only to temple priests. To burn kaifi was to invite the gods, to cleanse the air of impurity, and to calm the mind for dreams and visions. The smoke rising in slow spirals was seen as a bridge between human prayers and divine ears. Egyptian unguents were equally powerful. Oils infused with lotus, cedar, and juniper were used to anoint statues, mummies, and initiates. Each recipe carried layers of meaning. Lotus, blooming with the sun, was linked to rebirth. Cedar, resistant to decay, was tied to eternity. To place these oils on the skin was to clothe the body in the qualities of the cosmos. Priests spoke words of Heka as they applied them, sealing the effect not only physically but spiritually. To be anointed was not simply to smell pleasant. It was to be marked as chosen, shielded, and transformed. The secrecy around these recipes was intense. Instructions for making kaifi survive in fragments, but often the details are veiled in riddles or encoded in symbolic language. Some list ingredients with mythical names so that only the initiated would know the true plant or resin. Others disguise proportions with metaphors, such as the weight of a heart or the measure of a sunrise. This was intentional. To hand such power to anyone without training was considered dangerous. Oils and incense could heal, but in the wrong hands, they could harm. Protecting the formulas ensured they remained in the care of those who understood their responsibility. Over time, as Egypt came under foreign rule and Christianity rose to dominance, these recipes began to vanish. Temples were shut down, and with them the laboratories of priests. Yet, the memory did not disappear completely. Some formulas survived in hagiographies, the lives of saints, where stories of miraculous perfumes and healing oils often hid older Egyptian practices. Others slipped into grimoires and magical texts written in secret, where the line between prayer and potion blurred. Even in medieval Europe, whispers of incense that induced visions or oils that cast out spirits carried echoes of Egyptian originals. What is striking is how much of this knowledge was erased. While we can reconstruct fragments, the exact recipes remain lost. The Vatican and other institutions preserved texts, but often locked them away, ensuring that only a select few had access. The secrecy that began in temples was continued, though for very different reasons. In Egypt, the purpose was protection. In later centuries, it was control. Holy oils and secret recipes remind us that the senses themselves were once sacred gateways. Smell, touch, and breath were part of ritual technology, guiding the mind into altered states. When the formulas were hidden or destroyed, humanity lost not just perfumes, but an entire dimension of spiritual practice. The smoke of Kaifi may no longer rise in our temples, but the memory of its power still lingers in the silence of vanished recipes. In Egypt, the role of a priest was nothing like the role of a preacher today. He was not simply a figure who led prayers or gave sermons. He was more like a technician of the sacred, someone who had mastered precise skills needed to operate the machinery of ritual. The Egyptians believed that the cosmos was a system governed by laws, and the priest was the one trained to keep that system in balance. This was not work for the unprepared. It required years of discipline, training, and a life shaped by vows that touched even the smallest details of daily living. From an early age, candidates for priesthood entered schools attached to temples. They memorized vast portions of texts, learned to read the layered scripts, and practiced the chants that would later animate rituals. Memory was everything. Scrolls existed, but during ceremonies the priest could not pause to consult them. Every word had to be recited perfectly, every gesture executed with precision. A single slip could ruin the ceremony and risk upsetting Ma'at, the balance of the universe. Training, therefore, was long and unforgiving, shaping the mind into a vessel of accuracy. Purity was another cornerstone. Priests lived under strict vows that affected how they ate, how they dressed, and even how they spoke. Their diet excluded certain foods considered impure, and in many cases, meat was avoided before ceremonies. Shaving the entire body was common, not out of vanity, but as a ritual act of removing impurity. Silence was also part of their discipline. To restrain words outside of ritual was to strengthen the power of words during ritual. In this way, speech became a precious resource, guarded and spent only where it mattered. Midnight was the most sacred hour of their work. Long before dawn, while the rest of the city slept, priests entered the temples to perform rites that sustained the gods. Statues of deities were washed, anointed, dressed, and fed with offerings before anyone else saw them. These acts were not symbolic gestures. The Egyptians believed the gods truly inhabited their images, and the priests were their attendants. To miss a single night was unthinkable, for it meant neglecting the divine presence itself. The rhythm of their lives was tied to these midnight observances, ensuring that the link between heaven and earth never weakened. The priesthood was not open to everyone. It demanded loyalty, secrecy, and endurance. Those who served were respected, but also feared, for they worked with powers ordinary people could not see. They were mediators, healers, astronomers, and engineers of the sacred all at once. The blend of technical precision and spiritual devotion made them unique, unlike any other class in society. Later institutions would inherit this model, reshaping priests into monks and clergy, who also lived by vows of purity and silence. But in Egypt, the title of priest meant something closer to specialist, someone who treated ritual as a science. The priest was not only a servant of the gods, but a keeper of cosmic law, a technician of eternity whose every action kept the world from falling into chaos. When empires rose and religions shifted, Egyptian gods did not always vanish. Many of them simply changed names. This process, called syncretism, acted like camouflage. Rites that had been practiced for centuries did not always end when new faiths declared them forbidden. Instead, they slipped beneath the surface, taking on new forms, new titles, and sometimes even new feast days. The most striking example is Isis, the great mother goddess of Egypt, whose worship spread far beyond the Nile. By the time Christianity took root in the Mediterranean, her figure had already been reshaped into one that looked remarkably like the Virgin Mary. Isis was not a minor goddess. She was mother, healer, protector, and magician, adored across Egypt and later throughout Rome. Statues of her, nursing the infant Horus, show her as the tender mother of the divine child, a powerful image of love and protection. When Christianity rose to prominence, this image did not disappear. Instead, it was reborn. The Virgin Mary holding the baby Jesus echoes the same posture, the same symbolism, and in many cases even inherited the same sacred spaces. Shrines, once dedicated to Isis, were quietly converted into churches. Festivals once held for her were given new names. The people continued to celebrate, but under a new icon. This was not an accident. Syncretism was a survival strategy. By allowing old rituals to blend into new forms, communities preserved what they could of their traditions without openly defying the new authorities. When priests carried statues of Isis in processions, those processions eventually became Marian feasts. When hymns to Isis were sung, some were rewritten as hymns to Mary. The rhythm of ritual remained, even if the names had changed. Other gods underwent similar transformations. Osiris, Lord of Death and Resurrection, found echoes in the figure of Christ, whose own passion mirrored the cycle of death and return. Horus, the falcon child of Isis, was mirrored in the divine child who would grow to become saviour and king. Even minor Egyptian deities were sometimes absorbed into the vast cloud of saints, their attributes preserved but their names erased. A god of healing became a patron saint of medicine. A goddess of fertility became associated with feast days for mothers and children. The divine faces shifted, but the underlying functions remained. This camouflage ensured continuity. Rites of purification, offerings of bread and drink, processions with candles and incense, all carried forward into new religious settings. To the ordinary believer, the change was not always dramatic. The prayers still rose, the festivals still came, the Divine Mother still listened, but to those who looked closely, the similarities revealed an ancient lineage hidden in plain sight. When gods change names, it is not always a story of conquest or replacement. It is often a story of survival. Beneath the painted icons and rewritten texts lies a continuity of human longing, the same desire to connect with forces greater than ourselves. The Egyptians may have seen Isis, later generations saw Mary, but the gesture of reaching out to the Mother of Compassion remained unchanged. Through syncretism, the old gods lived on, wearing new faces, waiting for those with eyes to notice their disguise. Words can shape the way entire civilizations remember the past. In Egypt, the word Heka carried profound meaning. It did not mean trickery or illusion. It meant the power woven into the fabric of the universe, the force that allowed gods and humans to speak reality into being. Priests trained for years to master Heka, believing it to be a lawful science, a technology as real as the flooding of the Nile or the movement of the stars. But as new empires rose and Christianity spread, this word was deliberately twisted. Translation became a weapon. What had once been divine law was recast as dangerous superstition. Heka became magic, and magic became a slur. This shift was not innocent. Early Christian writers faced a challenge. They needed to separate their faith from the old religions of Egypt, Greece, and Babylon. But those religions had their own systems of power, ritual, and philosophy. To admit that Heka was lawful meant acknowledging that Egypt had its own science of the divine, so the strategy was simple: redefine the word. Where Egyptians saw sacred power, later translators wrote sorcery. Where Egyptians saw alignment with cosmic order, church fathers wrote demonic deception. The very act of translating Heka into Greek and Latin terms stripped it of its dignity and painted it as dangerous. By the 4th century, this rebranding was complete. Imperial decrees no longer described priests as keepers of sacred science, but as magicians who corrupted the people. The papyri that preserved ritual knowledge were dismissed as spell books. The chants, once used to heal or to guide the dead, were now called incantations of demons. Language itself became a battlefield, and the winners controlled the memory of the past. To label a practice as magic was enough to strip it of authority, no matter how lawful or structured it had once been. The consequences reached far beyond Egypt. Over centuries, the word magic gathered layers of fear and disdain. In medieval Europe, it became synonymous with heresy and witchcraft, punishable by death. Yet the irony is that many so-called magical practices, anointing with oil, purifying with water, invoking divine names, were identical to rituals absorbed into Christian sacraments. The difference was not in the acts themselves, but in the words used to frame them. A priest who anointed was holy. A priest of Isis who did the same was a sorcerer. This war on words explains why much of Egyptian ritual is misunderstood today. Modern readers, taught to see magic as fantasy or fraud, struggle to grasp that Heka was seen as natural law. The Egyptians did not separate science from spirituality. To them, words, gestures, and materials worked within the same system of cause and effect that governed rivers and stars. The deliberate mistranslation severed that understanding, leaving us with fragments distorted by centuries of suspicion. When we speak of magic today, we echo that ancient slur. But beneath the distortion lies the older truth of Heka, a reminder that power can be carried in language itself. To change a word is to change the world it describes, and in that shift, entire civilizations can be cast into shadow or brought into light. When Christianity took root in Egypt, it did not wipe the slate clean. The old ways did not vanish overnight, nor did the beliefs that had shaped the Nile Valley for thousands of years. Instead, they slipped beneath the surface, woven quietly into prayers, charms, and monastic rules. This subtle blending is what scholars call the Coptic veil, a half-hidden continuity where Egyptian ritual concepts lived on inside Christian forms. Beneath the hymns sung to Christ and the Virgin, echoes of Isis and Osiris can still be heard. Beneath the crosses carved into desert caves, older symbols of protection lingered, reshaped, but never erased. Coptic Christianity, spoken in the Egyptian language, written with Greek letters, became the vessel for this survival. Prayers preserved in Coptic often include phrases that mirror ancient invocations, calling on divine light to protect the soul, or speaking of the heart being weighed before judgment. These were not random coincidences. They were continuations of a spiritual vocabulary that had been passed down for generations. When monks recited these lines, they were carrying forward the rhythm of older chants, cloaked in Christian meaning but still rooted in Egyptian soil. Amulets tell the story even more clearly. For thousands of years, Egyptians had worn charms, inscribed with protective words or images, invoking the eye of Horus, the scarab, or the ankh. In Coptic times, the practice did not disappear. Instead, the symbols were replaced with crosses, saints' names, and fragments of scripture. Yet the belief remained the same. To wear a word close to the body was to shield the soul from harm. Some Coptic amulets even show a strange fusion, crosses entwined with hieroglyph-like forms or prayers written in patterns that recall older magical spells. The veil was thin, and through it, the past shone faintly. In the deserts of Egypt, where monasticism was born, the old discipline of the priests also survived. Rules for monks required purity, fasting, silence, and prayer at fixed hours patterns nearly identical to the routines of Egyptian temple priests. Midnight vigils, daily ablutions, and strict diets were not inventions of Christian ascetics, but continuations of a lifestyle long established in the service of the gods. The temple became the monastery, the priest became the monk, and the rituals of order became rules of holiness. The Coptic veil allowed this transformation to take place quietly, ensuring survival even when official decrees condemned the past. The result is a Christianity unlike any other. Egyptian at its roots, it carries the weight of two traditions at once. Beneath the prayers to Christ lies the memory of Ma'at, the balance of truth and order. Beneath the icons of saints lies the resilience of older gods hidden in new clothing. The Coptic veil shows us that history is rarely about clean breaks. More often, it is about continuity in disguise, a survival strategy written into words, objects, and practices so ordinary that few ever notice. What looks like new faith is often ancient memory wearing another face. In the shifting world of late antiquity, when Egypt was no longer ruled by pharaohs but by Greeks and then Romans, a strange collection of texts emerged. These were the Greek-Egyptian magical papyri, known today by the abbreviation PGM. They were not official temple liturgies, nor were they polished works of philosophy. They were spellbooks, handwritten guides for rituals that blended Greek, Egyptian, and even Jewish elements into one eclectic system. Somehow, against the odds, these papyri survived. Preserved by accident, hidden in secrecy, and rediscovered centuries later, they remain one of the clearest windows into how the old rites refused to die. The papyri contain everything from hymns to invocations, recipes for potions, instructions for summoning gods, and rituals for protection or healing. What makes them remarkable is the way they fuse traditions. A single text might call on Egyptian deities like Isis or Thoth, Greek gods like Helios, and biblical figures all within the same breath. The result is not confusion but continuity, a survival strategy in a world where older religions were being pushed underground. By blending traditions, the rituals could hide in plain sight. What looked like foreign names stitched together was in fact the Egyptian current flowing quietly beneath. One famous spell from the collection calls on the Headless One, a mysterious figure linked to Egyptian creation myths. Another gives instructions for creating a dream oracle by sacrificing bread to a god and then sleeping in silence, hoping for visions. Many describe the use of sacred names, long strings of vowels, and strange syllables meant to carry power when chanted. To modernize, they might look chaotic, but to the initiate they were precise formulas, fragments of Heka reframed in Greek script. The survival of the PGM is itself a story of chance. Most official temple archives were destroyed or seized during waves of persecution, yet these spellbooks were personal possessions, tucked away in tombs or hidden in the sands. Some were buried with their owners, others abandoned and forgotten until archaeologists stumbled upon them in the 18th and 19th centuries. Had they been official, they likely would have been burned as heresy. Their very obscurity saved them. For scholars today, the PGM are both frustrating and thrilling. Frustrating because they are incomplete, damaged, and often difficult to interpret. Thrilling because they reveal what priests and magicians were actually doing outside the polished stone walls of temples. They show how ordinary people adapted rituals, how the sacred science of Egypt trickled down into the hands of craftsmen, healers, and those desperate for protection in a changing world. The Greek-Egyptian magical papyri are proof that Egypt's sacred technology was not erased. It simply shifted forms, hiding in scraps of papyrus written by unknown hands. Against centuries of bans and condemnations, these texts survived, and in their chants and recipes we hear echoes of the Nile, whispers of priests who refused to let their science vanish completely, even if it meant disguising it in the language of their conquerors. When the great temples of Egypt fell silent and the scrolls of Alexandria burned, it might have seemed that the old knowledge was gone forever. Yet, there was another place where texts continued to live, though not always in the open. The monasteries that spread across Egypt and beyond became unexpected vaults of memory. Their walls echoed not only with prayers, but with the scratching of pens in scriptoria, the writing rooms where monks copied texts by hand. These scriptoria were the last line of defense for many works, but they were also places of quiet control. where choices were made about what would survive and what would disappear into forbidden shelves. The act of copying was more than preservation. Every time a scribe put pen to parchment, he had the chance to edit, correct, or reshape. A word could be altered, a phrase softened, or a passage omitted entirely. In this way, ritual knowledge that had once spoken clearly of Isis, Osiris, or Heka could be smoothed into language that fit a Christian worldview. The skeleton of the old rite might remain, but its names and images were replaced. What had once been an invocation of the sun god could become a hymn to the true light of Christ. The ritual survived in form but not in name. Not all texts were rewritten. Some were quietly sequestered, hidden in the back shelves of monastery libraries where only a few had access. Scrolls carried into monasteries by fleeing priests or sympathetic converts were not always destroyed. Instead, they were labelled, set aside, and placed under restrictions. A monk might be told these works are dangerous, not to be read, yet still the community kept them. In this way, the monasteries functioned both as guardians and as censors. They did not burn everything. They controlled it, deciding what knowledge would remain public and what would remain private. There was also a quiet traffic of scrolls, passed hand to hand by travellers and traders. Pilgrims who visited desert monasteries sometimes carried away fragments, copied by monks who perhaps sensed the importance of preserving at least a portion. Some of these fragments ended up in hidden jars or buried caches, discovered centuries later in places like Nag Hammadi. Others vanished into private collections where they remain out of reach. This silent flow of manuscripts shows how the old knowledge was never completely extinguished. It simply changed guardians. The irony is that the very institutions that worked hardest to erase Egypt's ritual memory also ensured parts of it survived. Without monastic vaults, even the fragments we have today might have been lost. Yet survival came at a price. What we read now often comes filtered through layers of copying and censorship, shaped to fit doctrines that mistrusted the very ideas they were preserving. Monasteries were not neutral. They were battlegrounds where ink replaced fire and where silence was as powerful as destruction. Within their scriptoria, the fate of ancient Egypt's sacred science was decided line by line, margin by margin, shelf by hidden shelf. When we picture an exorcism today, we often imagine a priest holding a cross, reading from a book, and commanding a spirit to depart. The words are firm, the gestures precise, and the belief is that the authority of God flows through the ritual to expel the unseen force. What most people do not realize is how closely this structure mirrors the older adjurations of Egypt. Long before Christian exorcists stood in candlelit rooms, Egyptian priests were speaking formulas to drive out hostile spirits, heal the sick, and restore balance. The difference lies mostly in vocabulary. The framework, the rhythm, and even the confidence in spoken command remained strikingly the same. Egyptian adjurations were built on the power of names. A priest might call upon Ra, Isis, or Thoth to lend authority to his command. He would begin with an invocation, naming the higher powers that gave him the right to speak, then directly address the spirit, ordering it to leave the body or space it had invaded. The structure was formulaic: identify, command, threaten if needed, then seal the action with a protective word. Christian exorcism manuals follow the same pattern. They begin with the invocation of the Trinity or the Virgin, address the demon, order it to depart, and seal the act with signs of the cross and words like Amen. The flow is almost identical, only the names have changed. The materials also show parallels. Egyptians burned incense, sprinkled water, and anointed with oils as part of their rituals of expulsion. These elements were thought to purify the air, cleanse the body, and weaken the grip of hostile forces. Christian exorcists adopted similar gestures, using holy water, blessed oil, and the burning of incense in churches. To the believer, these are entirely Christian practices. yet they echo the toolkit of Egyptian ritualists who had already used scent, water, and light to banish darkness. The continuity is so clear that some historians believe early clerics simply repurposed Egyptian formulas by swapping out the divine names. Where an Egyptian papyrus might read in the name of Isis, "I command you to depart," a Christian text reads in the name of Christ, "I command you." The authority changes, but the underlying idea remains that a higher power speaks through the ritualist and the spirit has no choice but to obey. Even the threats, promising torment in fire or binding in chains, appear in both traditions, showing that the logic of control over the unseen did not disappear with the fall of temples. What this tells us is that the boundary between enchanter and exorcist was thinner than later history suggests. Both were specialists trained in sacred words, both acted as protectors of their communities, and both relied on ritual speech to move unseen forces. By branding one as sorcery and the other as sacrament, institutions drew a line that may not have existed in practice. Beneath the surface, the clerical exorcist and the Egyptian enchanter were performing variations of the same ancient craft, proving once again that rituals rarely vanish. They adapt, they change their names, and they continue in forms that feel familiar even when their origins are forgotten. In Egypt, the body was never seen as a disposable shell. It was a vessel of eternity, carefully prepared to house the soul in its journeys beyond death. Mummification was not a superstition, but a science, a system designed to preserve the physical form so that the Ka and Ba could return to it whenever needed. To perfect the body was to ensure survival in the afterlife. Centuries later, when Christianity spread and the cult of relics began, the echoes of this Egyptian vision were unmistakable. Bones, hair, and even entire corpses of saints were treated with the same reverence once given to mummies, as if the holiness of a person lingered within their remains. The Egyptians believed that incorruptibility was proof of divine favour. A body that resisted decay was a body aligned with cosmic order. Priests wrapped the dead in linen, anointed them with oils, and sealed them in stone tombs so that time could not easily claim them. The body became an object of veneration, not because of nostalgia, but because it was believed to contain power. When pilgrims in later centuries visited the shrines of Christian saints and found bodies that had not decayed, they saw this as a miracle. Yet to the Egyptian mind this was familiar. It was the same logic that had preserved pharaohs and priests in their coffins, bodies perfected to endure as channels of sacred energy. Relics played a similar role to mummies. To touch a bone of a saint was believed to transmit healing or blessing, just as contact with the preserved body of an ancestor in Egypt was thought to strengthen the living. In both cases, the body was not merely a symbol, it was a medium of presence, proof that the boundary between life and death was porous. Carrying a fragment of bone, wearing a scrap of linen, or even standing near a sarcophagus meant standing in the aura of sanctity. The continuity of practice is clear, even if the language shifted from Osiris to Christ. The debates over incorruptibility in medieval Europe can also be read through an Egyptian lens. Was a saint's body preserved by divine intervention or by natural conditions like dryness and embalming? The same question had been asked silently for centuries in Egypt, where the line between art and miracle blurred. Was it the careful work of embalmers, or the favour of the gods that made a body endure? For the Egyptians, the answer did not matter. What mattered was that the body lasted, and in its lasting proved the reality of the divine. The body problem, as scholars call it, reveals one of the deepest links between ancient Egypt and later Christianity. Both traditions refused to let the body simply rot away. Both saw in its preservation a sign of sacred truth. Whether wrapped in linen within a pyramid or lying beneath the altar of a church, the perfected body became a testimony of faith. To venerate relics or mummies was to believe that holiness could be touched, that eternity could dwell in flesh, and that the dead were never truly gone as long as their bodies remained. In ancient Egypt, time was not just counted. It was lived as part of ritual. The rising of Sirius marked the new year. Temple corridors were aligned with the solstice sunrise, and festivals unfolded according to a cosmic rhythm that mirrored the movements of stars. To change the calendar was not a bureaucratic adjustment. It was an assault on the structure of ritual itself. The Egyptians believed that rites performed at the wrong moment lost their power. A hymn sung a day late was not merely delayed, it was broken. For priests who tracked celestial events with care, time was the invisible foundation on which the temple stood. The Egyptians built their year on 3 seasons tied to the Nile: the flooding, the planting, and the harvest. Each season carried its own ceremonies, offerings, and processions. These were not random celebrations, but essential acts to harmonize human life with divine order. When Sirius rose just before dawn in midsummer, the temples rang with New Year hymns, and offerings were made to secure fertility and abundance. Alignments of temples like Karnak ensured that light would strike the sanctuaries at exact moments, turning architecture into a calendar of stone. Ritual, architecture, and astronomy formed a seamless system, but as foreign powers gained control, new calendars were imposed. The Romans introduced the Julian calendar, later replaced by the Gregorian reform under Pope Gregory XIII in the 16th century. These changes were meant to correct errors in measuring the solar year, but they also severed the connection between sacred observances and the rhythms of the stars. What had once been aligned with Sirius or Orion now followed the decrees of emperors and popes. Festivals shifted, feasts were reassigned, and the link between heaven and earth grew weaker. For the old Egyptian rites, this was devastating. If time itself no longer matched the cosmic order, how could the rituals work? This struggle over calendars is what some call the calendar war. It was not fought with weapons, but with dates. By redefining time, rulers redefined ritual authority. A pope who declared Easter must fall on a certain Sunday claimed the same power once held by priests who watched the heliacal rising of Sirius. Control of the calendar meant control of memory, of tradition, and of the rhythm of belief. To move a feast day was to move the people's devotion. To change the count of years was to reshape history itself. The Egyptians understood time as a cycle, ever returning, while later systems pushed toward a linear march of years. That change was more than philosophy. It transformed how people experienced the sacred. A ritual that once connected humans with eternal recurrence became trapped in the narrow channel of human decree. The stars still rose, temples still aligned, but their voices were muffled by new clocks. The calendar war left scars not visible in stone, but carved into the flow of time itself, a reminder that when you control the calendar, you control not only the present, but the very heartbeat of ritual. When people look at the soaring spires of Gothic cathedrals, they often see them as uniquely European creations, born in the Middle Ages and perfected by Christian architects. Yet beneath the pointed arches and stained glass lies an older skeleton, one that stretches back to the temples of ancient Egypt. The logic of space, light, and procession that defined Karnak and Luxor was not lost when the old gods fell silent. It was carried forward, reshaped in stone and glass, and given new names. Gothic cathedrals may look like a different skin, but their bones are unmistakably Egyptian. In Egypt, the temple was a cosmos in miniature. The outer courts represented the human world. The hypostyle halls evoked the primordial marshes, and the inner sanctuaries symbolized the dwelling of the gods. To move through a temple was to move through creation itself, step by step, light fading as one approached the holiest chamber. Gothic cathedrals followed the same script. Entering through wide doors, the faithful crossed a nave filled with light, before being drawn along a central axis toward the high altar. Side chapels mirrored side chambers, clerestory windows replaced skylights, and the eastward orientation ensured that the rising sun still marked the heart of the building. The pattern was ancient, the message eternal. Light played a central role in both systems. At Karnak, shafts of sunlight pierced corridors on solstice mornings, illuminating the sanctuary for only a brief moment each year. This was no accident. It was an architectural ritual binding the temple to the heavens. In Gothic cathedrals, the same obsession with light reappeared, this time through stained glass. Sunlight filtered into sacred colours, telling stories, and transforming space into vision. The idea was not simply to illuminate, but to spiritualize, to remind worshippers that they were stepping into a cosmic order where heaven touched earth. The tools had changed, but the logic was the same. Procession was another shared element. Egyptian rites often began with statues of gods carried along temple avenues, accompanied by chanting priests and crowds of devotees. The architecture was designed to guide these movements, with pylons marking thresholds and obelisks framing entrances. In Gothic cathedrals, processions of clergy, relics, and icons followed similar paths. The long nave, the side aisles, the gradual narrowing toward the choir, all functioned as ritual corridors. The building itself directed bodies and voices, just as the temples had done centuries before. Even the sense of height was not new. The Egyptians used towering columns carved with lotus and papyrus to evoke the forest of creation. Walking among them, one felt dwarfed, lifted into a space larger than human scale. Gothic architects echoed this with vertical lines that drew the eye upward, ribbed vaults that soared like branches, and spires that pierced the sky. To stand inside Chartres or Amiens is to feel the same awe that must have filled visitors to Karnak, a reminder that architecture can make the human seem small and the divine vast. Gothic cathedrals did not arise from nothing. They inherited the bones of an older system, one that had long understood how to shape space into cosmos. The names of the gods had changed, the symbols had shifted, but the blueprint endured. In their grandeur we still glimpse the shadow of Egypt, standing quietly beneath the stones. During the Renaissance, Europe rediscovered Egypt, or at least the version of Egypt that was allowed to surface. After centuries of silence, fragments of texts known as the Hermetica began to circulate, writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a figure who blended the Greek god Hermes with the Egyptian god Thoth. These texts spoke of divine wisdom, the unity of the cosmos, and the possibility of transforming the soul through knowledge. To Renaissance thinkers hungry for ancient authority, they were a revelation. Egypt once again became a source of wonder, but only through a carefully filtered lens. What emerged was not the full depth of Egyptian ritual science, but a curated Egypt, a safe Egypt, stripped of its most powerful and unsettling practices. The Hermetica arrived in Florence in the 15th century, translated by Marsilio Ficino under the patronage of the Medici. Scholars believed they had found the oldest wisdom of humanity, older even than Plato or Moses. For a moment, it seemed that the gates of forgotten Egypt had opened. Yet, the texts that circulated were not full ritual manuals, but philosophical dialogues, poetic reflections on the soul, the stars, and divine order. They inspired art, alchemy, and secret societies, but they were only the tip of the iceberg. The operative rites, the chants, the anointings, the midnight ceremonies that had once been the backbone of Egyptian practice remained buried. This selective revival was not an accident. Church authorities tolerated the Hermetica because they could be read as symbolic, allegorical, and ultimately harmless to doctrine. Ficino himself bent over backward to harmonize them with Christianity, arguing that Hermes Trismegistus had foreseen the coming of Christ. In this way, Egypt was allowed back into Europe, but only as a sage in philosopher's robes, not as a priest calling down stars with ritual. Anything too close to actual magical practice was censored, ignored, or quietly condemned. A sanitized Egypt entered the Renaissance, while the dangerous Egypt stayed locked in vaults. The fascination spread nonetheless. Artists painted Egyptian motifs, architects borrowed obelisks, and secret brotherhoods whispered of ancient wisdom hidden in symbols. Alchemists saw in the Hermetica a key to transmutation, not only of metals, but of the soul. Yet even they worked with fragments, incomplete formulas, missing the embodied techniques that had once brought words to life. The smoke of Kaifi, the alignments of temples, the weighing of the heart, these remained in silence. What Europe embraced was the idea of Egypt rather than its living practice. This controlled revival reveals the delicate balance of power. The Church could not ignore the allure of ancient wisdom, yet it feared the operative force of rites that bypassed its authority. So Egypt was revived in words, but not in deeds, in philosophy, but not in ritual. Scholars could quote Hermes, artists could paint pyramids, but the old priestly science remained in the shadows, classified as dangerous magic. Renaissance Egyptomania reminds us that history is often not rediscovered but repackaged. What looked like a revival was really a curation, a gallery of safe fragments meant to inspire but never to disrupt. The full Egypt, the one of midnight chambers and star-timed chants, was still there, but buried deeper than ever, waiting for another age to ask the questions no one in the 15th century dared to ask. By the time European explorers began to set their eyes on the sands of Egypt in the 17th and 18th centuries, the land of pyramids and temples had already been cloaked in centuries of silence. Jesuit antiquarians, travellers, and later professional Egyptologists walked among the ruins with notebooks in hand, sketching, cataloguing, and speculating. Yet what they chose to publish, what they buried in footnotes, and what they quietly boxed away reveals as much about their motives as about the monuments themselves. Egypt was being rediscovered, but only through a filter of control. The Jesuits were among the first to study the ruins systematically. To them, Egypt represented a double-edged mystery. On one hand, it was admired as the cradle of ancient wisdom, the place where geometry, astronomy, and philosophy were said to have been born. On the other, it was seen as a dangerous reminder of pagan ritual, a rival to the authority of the Church. Reports that reached European audiences often praised the grandeur of the pyramids or the mathematical genius of temple alignments, but references to rituals, to magic, to the whispered power of the old gods were softened or left out entirely. The past was made respectable by trimming away the parts that looked too alive. When Napoleon's army invaded Egypt at the close of the 18th century, he brought not only soldiers, but a corps of scholars. Their findings filled the monumental Description de l'Egypte, an encyclopedic work that amazed Europe. Engravings of temples, hieroglyphs, and colossal statues captured the imagination of the public. Yet, even here, what was chosen for display mattered. Scenes of daily life, architecture, and art were emphasized, while ritual texts and magical formulas were often relegated to obscure appendices or dismissed as curiosities. The image of Egypt was framed as monumental and noble, but its spiritual science was treated as superstition unworthy of serious attention. Early Egyptologists followed the same pattern. Champollion's breakthrough in deciphering hieroglyphs in the year 1822 opened the door to Egypt's texts, but even as translations emerged, choices were made. Funerary texts were published as the Book of the Dead, stripped of their initiatory depth, and presented as primitive spells for the afterlife. Ritual papyri that spoke of invoking gods or harnessing cosmic power were labelled as magical nonsense. Scholars eager to build the field's reputation preferred to highlight what aligned with Western ideas of history, law, and religion, while the stranger parts were boxed away in archives, uncatalogued or deliberately ignored. This silence was not accidental. To acknowledge the sophistication of Egyptian ritual science would have meant admitting that Europe's spiritual lineage was more complicated than it wished to believe. It was safer to treat Egypt as a museum of dead culture rather than a living source of knowledge. So, the great sphinxes and obelisks were transported to European capitals, displayed in squares and museums, while the deeper meanings that once animated them remained buried in silence. The story of scholars, sphinxes, and silences is a story of selective memory. Egypt was unearthed, but only in pieces deemed safe for public consumption. The rest was footnoted, boxed, or left to gather dust in forbidden shelves. And so, even in its so-called rediscovery, Egypt remained half-hidden, its voice muted by those who claimed to speak for it. When Napoleon set foot in Egypt in the year 1798, he carried with him not just armies but scholars, engineers, and artists. His invasion was more than a military campaign. It was an expedition to capture the soul of a civilization long buried beneath sand and myth. Out of that campaign came the massive Description de l'Egypte, a treasure of engravings and reports that dazzled Europe. Yet the true jewel unearthed during those years was a broken slab of basalt that would change history forever, the Rosetta Stone. This stone would eventually speak, giving scholars the key to unlock hieroglyphs, and with them, the voices of ancient Egypt. But even as it opened doors, it also cast shadows, because the Egypt that emerged was carefully edited for public taste. The Rosetta Stone was discovered in 1799 near the town of Rashid by French soldiers. Its inscription was unique. The same text appeared in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek. For centuries, hieroglyphs had been a mystery, dismissed as symbols of superstition or a secret code with no grammar. Suddenly, here was a trilingual key, a chance to decode the language of the pharaohs. Scholars like Thomas Young made early progress, but it was Jean-François Champollion who cracked the code in 1822. By matching hieroglyphs with their Greek equivalents, he proved that these sacred signs were not mere pictures, but a full language. Egypt could finally speak again. The discovery electrified Europe. Ancient texts, once dismissed as gibberish, could now be read. Inscriptions on temple walls revealed histories of kings, hymns to gods, and rituals once thought lost. Yet, as translations spread, a choice was made about what to emphasize. Scholars highlighted royal decrees, genealogies, and architecture. They published tales of pharaohs, wars, and monumental building projects. But the more devotional texts, the prayers, the invocations, the spells of the Book of Coming Forth by Day, were handled cautiously. They were presented as quaint relics of a primitive belief system rather than as the refined spiritual science Egyptians had seen them to be. This editing was deliberate. To present Egypt as a noble ancestor of civilization was acceptable. To admit that its ritual system rivaled or even surpassed aspects of Christianity was unthinkable. So the Rosetta Stone gave the world words, but those words were filtered. Hymns to Ra were published as myth. Chants invoking Isis were footnoted as magical curiosities. Ritual diagrams were boxed away in archives, inaccessible to the public. The Egypt that people met in books and museums was grand and majestic, but safely dead, stripped of living practice. Napoleon's shadow lingered in all this. His campaign had awakened Europe to Egypt's importance, but it also framed Egypt as a conquest, something to be collected, studied, and displayed, rather than truly understood. The Rosetta breakthrough was celebrated as a triumph of European scholarship, rather than as the return of Egypt's own voice. In this way, the stone that spoke also became the stone that was silenced, allowing only certain words to pass into public memory. Egypt had been unlocked, but not freed. Its deepest truths remained veiled, edited to fit the story Europe wanted to tell. By the 19th century, the sands of Egypt were giving up secrets faster than ever before. Tombs opened, temples cleared, papyri unrolled. Archaeologists raced to collect fragments of a civilization that had been buried for millennia. But with each discovery came a dilemma. Some finds lined up neatly with the story Europe and the Church wished to tell. Pharaohs could be presented as proud rulers, temples as majestic ruins, hieroglyphs as ancient poetry. Yet other discoveries were not so convenient. Ritual manuals, funerary texts, and medical papyri hinted at a science of the soul that complicated doctrine. Whenever such finds appeared, they met not with celebration, but with polite dismissal. The politics of what was published, labelled, and displayed shaped how the world would see Egypt, and what it would never be allowed to see. In museums across Europe, the politics was subtle but clear. A mummy could be shown as an example of ancient superstition, a curiosity of embalming, but not as evidence of a world-view where body and soul were inseparable. A papyrus describing spells of protection might be displayed under the label magic, a word that stripped it of seriousness, rather than presented as part of a lawful ritual system. Even when translations made clear that these texts spoke of cosmic order, spiritual purification, and transformation of the self, the language used to present them turned them into oddities. Egypt's wisdom was reclassified as superstition. Permissions were another tool of control. Scholars who wanted to study sensitive manuscripts often needed approval from church officials or colonial authorities. Some requests were granted, others quietly denied. Papyri that dealt with healing, incantations, or invocation of deities were sometimes kept locked away, accessible only to a handful of approved academics. Excavation permits could be withdrawn if a dig threatened to reveal something awkward for official narratives. The past was not simply uncovered, it was managed. One telling example lies in how the Book of Coming Forth by Day was treated. Early translators presented it as the Book of the Dead, emphasizing funerals and tombs, while downplaying its role as a guide for the living. By branding it as funerary superstition, its initiatory teachings about consciousness, ethics, and transformation could be dismissed. This pattern repeated across artifacts. Temples aligned with solstices were explained as primitive astronomy. Ritual oils became exotic perfumes. Incantations became folklore. The labels told the public what to think, and anything that clashed with doctrine was reduced to background noise. The tension between archaeology and liturgy was not only academic, it was political. To admit that Egypt had a sophisticated spiritual science would raise uncomfortable questions about the originality of later religions. Better to present Egypt as a fallen civilization whose wonders were material, not spiritual. In this way, archaeology became a tool not just for discovery, but for censorship. The glass cases of museums did not simply display the past, they edited it. Visitors walked through halls of mummies and statues thinking they were seeing Egypt, when in truth they were seeing a version of it curated to fit a narrow frame. The rest remained hidden in storerooms, in archives, or in silence, proof that even in death, Egypt's rites were still on trial. To imagine how an Egyptian ceremony unfolded, we must gather fragments scattered across tomb walls, papyri, and temple reliefs. No single text offers a full script. Instead, there are glimpses, moments preserved in stone or ink, like pieces of a puzzle that once formed a complete ritual. When placed together, they suggest a pattern. It begins with purification, flows into the power of naming, invites the presence of a god through indwelling, and culminates in procession. What emerges is not superstition, but a carefully designed technology of the sacred. The rite began with purification. Priests washed in cool water drawn from sacred lakes beside the temples, water believed to carry the first freshness of creation. They shaved their heads and bodies, dressed in pure linen, and anointed themselves with oils. The purpose was not only cleanliness, but alignment. To approach the gods, one had to become clear, empty, and balanced, just as the world had been at the dawn of time. Hymns of Ma'at, the principle of order and truth, were spoken as water was poured over statues, altars, and even the floors of the sanctuary. The stage was set, next came naming. In Egyptian thought, to name something was to bring it into being. A statue of a god was not yet divine until its name was spoken over it, inscribed, or whispered in ritual. Priests chanted long litanies of divine names, some familiar like Ra or Osiris, others long strings of syllables meant to capture secret aspects of the gods. At this point, Hieroglyphs carved into amulets or scrolls were activated by voice. The act of naming gave the material object a spiritual address. It was no longer stone or ink. It was a doorway. Then came indwelling. Through chants, incense, and gestures, the presence of the deity was invited to inhabit the statue, the temple, or the person being initiated. This was not symbolic. To the Egyptians, it was real. The god entered the world of matter through carefully prepared channels, drawn down by the authority of Heka, the lawful power of words and ritual acts. The sanctuary became charged, the statue no longer stone but alive with presence. Priests fanned incense smoke, traced gestures with their hands, and sealed the union with anointing. For a moment, heaven and earth touched. Finally, procession carried the presence into the world. The statue of the god, now indwelt, was lifted on a sacred bark and carried through temple halls into open courtyards and streets. Crowds gathered, chanting, offering food, beer, and flowers. The god was not distant, but moving among the people, blessing fields and homes, renewing cosmic balance. The rhythm of drums, the shining of torches, and the scent of incense turned the city into a theatre of divinity. When the procession returned to the sanctuary, the cycle closed, ready to begin again with purification at dawn. This blueprint, reconstructed from fragments, shows the elegance of Egyptian ritual. Each stage purification, naming, indwelling, procession built on the last, creating a chain of transformation. The rite was not merely spectacle, it was a system of aligning humans, gods, and cosmos, a rhythm that shaped Egypt for thousands of years. Even in fragments, its outline still speaks. To remember can be an act of rebellion. In the centuries after the fall of Egypt's temples, remembering certain rites became not just discouraged, but criminal. It was no longer acceptable to speak of the old formulas, to describe the way incense was blended, or to recall the chants that once called gods into statues. To practice them openly risked being branded a sorcerer or heretic, punishable by exile, imprisonment, or death. What was once the heart of civilization was recast as dangerous superstition. And yet the silence was not simply about fear of spirits, it was about power. Forgetfulness served those who wished to control the present. The transformation of ritual into taboo did not happen overnight. As Christianity spread, bishops issued warnings against sacrifices, against the use of charms, against the consulting of oracles. What they were really doing was targeting fragments of Egyptian practice that had survived in homes and villages. A mother whispering protective words over her child, a farmer pouring libations into the soil, a healer burning resins for purification. All of these acts carried echoes of temple science. By outlawing them, the church cleared space for its own rites to dominate. Baptism replaced the old purifications. Mass replaced temple offerings. Exorcism replaced adjurations. Forgetting Egypt meant accepting the church as the only gatekeeper of the sacred. Even describing the old operations became dangerous. Scholars who tried to record incantations or rituals risked their reputations. To admit that the ancients had once wielded lawful power over the unseen was to question the claim that truth belonged only to the present faith. So descriptions were buried in obscure footnotes or framed in mocking language. The Book of the Dead was presented as a collection of superstitions. Magical papyri were labelled as nonsense. Memory was twisted into ridicule, so that even when the knowledge was preserved, it could not be taken seriously. The real question is, who benefited? Forgetfulness served two masters. For the church, it ensured monopoly over ritual. If only one set of sacraments remained, then all spiritual authority flowed through clerical hands. For secular powers, it simplified history, painting the past as chaotic and the present as enlightened. A people who believed their ancestors lived in darkness would not look back for inspiration. They would look upward to priests and rulers for light. To erase memory was to secure obedience. And yet memory never vanished completely. Fragments survived in folk customs, in whispered prayers, in the secret writings of mystics and alchemists. But to remember openly was a crime. The punishment was not only external, imposed by law or by fire. It was internal. Generations grew up never learning what their ancestors had known. The chain of memory was broken not just by decree, but by silence. Forgetfulness became the default state, enforced not by force but by absence. The crime of remembering is perhaps the deepest wound in human history. It is the deliberate cutting of the thread that binds us to our past. By making memory itself dangerous, those in power secured their control. And yet the fragments that survive remind us that forgetting is never total. Memory waits, hidden in texts and ruins, waiting for someone brave enough to ask the forbidden questions once again. Some of Egypt did not vanish into vaults or flames. It walked quietly into daily life, disguised as ordinary custom, hidden in the rhythm of festivals, or carved into the walls of churches. What survived in plain sight was never announced as Egyptian, yet its roots were unmistakable. These fragments remind us that memory can endure not just in secret archives, but in the habits of people who never stopped practicing what their ancestors once knew. Take festivals. Many rural communities in Europe still mark feast days by timing them to solstices or equinoxes, carrying icons in processions that echo the barks of Egyptian gods. The calendar may list the day as St. John or St. Mary, but the rhythm traces back to temples that once aligned with the rising of Sirius or the flooding of the Nile. The processional path through village streets, the music, the offerings of food and drink, all mirror ancient patterns. The names changed, but the choreography survived. Protective charms tell a similar story. Egyptians wore amulets of the Eye of Horus, or scarabs, for health and safe passage. Centuries later, Christian believers wore crosses, medals of saints, or small parchment prayers folded into lockets. The idea that an object could carry spiritual force never disappeared. It only shifted symbols. Even today, people hang charms in cars, on doorways, or on necklaces, often without realizing they are repeating a logic first inscribed on Egyptian papyri. Protection by symbol is one of the oldest inheritances humanity carries, and it has lived quietly in plain sight. Church architecture also bears the bones of Egypt. Step into a cathedral and notice the eastward orientation, the long nave, the gradual narrowing toward the altar. This is the same axis that guided Egyptian temples from light to shadow, from outer court to inner sanctuary. Stained glass windows cast coloured light across stone floors, just as Egyptian priests once directed beams of sunlight into sanctuaries on precise days. The faithful entering these spaces may believe they are walking into something entirely new, but the spatial logic is older than the cross. It is Egyptian skeleton beneath Gothic skin. Even small customs bear the trace. Sprinkling holy water at thresholds recalls Egyptian purification rites. Lighting candles in prayer mirrors oil lamps left in tombs to guide the soul. The waving of incense during Mass recreates the smoke-filled sanctuaries where Egyptian priests invited gods to descend. These acts are rarely seen as Egyptian, yet their DNA is there. They survived not by being hidden, but by becoming ordinary, so ordinary that no one questioned them. What survived in plain sight proves that history cannot be completely erased. The most effective way to preserve something is not always secrecy, but familiarity. When a ritual becomes daily habit, it slips under the radar of censorship. Egypt lives on not just in ruins and papyri, but in festivals, symbols, and spaces still used today. We pass it every time we walk into a church, light a candle, or wear a charm. We are surrounded by fragments of a forgotten civilization that never truly left us, hiding in the open, waiting to be recognized. History is often described as a story we inherit, but what if that story is missing chapters locked away in hidden rooms? For centuries, the Vatican and other custodians of ancient knowledge have held manuscripts, maps, and ritual records behind closed doors. The excuse has always been protection, preservation, or the fear that the public would misunderstand what they contain. Yet silence is not preservation. Silence is control. To lock the archive is to dim the lamp of human memory, forcing generation after generation to walk in shadows. The time has come to open the doors, to let the light flood in, to give humanity back the rites and records that belong to it. The Egyptian rituals we have traced were not idle superstition. They were systems of knowledge, ways of aligning the human soul with the cosmos, of connecting communities to cycles of stars, rivers, and seasons. To erase or hide them is not to protect truth, but to mutilate it. A civilization does not vanish because its temples crumble. It vanishes when its memory is suppressed. The hidden archives, stacked with papyri, codices, and relics of a forgotten science, are the missing organs of a body we are still trying to bring back to life. Until they are opened, our history will remain half alive, breathing unevenly in the dark. Transparency is not just an academic request, it is a moral necessity. Imagine if the suppressed Gospels, the sealed papyri, the forbidden recipes of oils and incenses were made available to all. Imagine scholars from every culture, not only those sanctioned by a single institution, working together to piece the fragments into wholeness. Imagine young people reading the words their ancestors once spoke, seeing that their search for meaning was not so different from ours today. The archive is not just a vault of the past. It is a reservoir of potential futures. To keep it closed is to deny humanity the chance to grow into itself. Who benefits from silence? Power always does. When one group controls access to knowledge, it controls the story. And when it controls the story, it controls the people who live by it. But the opposite is also true. When the archive is opened, when memory flows freely, power shifts back to everyone. The locked room becomes a shared space. The lamp no longer belongs to priests in stone halls. It belongs to all of us, illuminating not just the past but the path forward. The final appeal is simple. History does not need to remain a riddle. The lamp is ready to be lit. Open the archive, release the rites, restore the record. Let us see not only what was convenient to preserve, but also what was feared, suppressed, or labelled too dangerous. Light does not diminish when shared. It grows brighter. The time of secrecy has stretched long enough. The past is waiting. The lock is old. The key is transparency. And once the door is opened, no one will ever be able to close it again.